Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beit-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. We're in our short season of episodes with women authors, which is a very broad category that happily allows us to talk to the many wonderful women who write books as part of their great life and career journeys. And today we have a first for us, a novelist, Katherine Feghali, author of Glass Cedars. It's a book about Lebanon and the US set in the Lebanese Civil War that raged for 15 years as of 1975. And at its heart is Maya, a young woman. A great read about being an other in two lands. And we are delighted to have Katherine Feghali here with us today to talk about it. Hi, Kathy. Great to see you.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with such a great group. And I just want to start by giving a bit of background on my novel and why I wrote it. The novel heavily parallels my life, and it starts with my most life-defining moments. And I think if we all stop to think about it, we all have life-defining moments. It could be a divorce, it could be a death of someone we love, it could be declaring bankruptcy or building a company, but they're moments that define our lives. My most life-defining moment happened when I was woken up early one morning by my mother and told I had 1 hour to pack one suitcase and leave everything I had ever known. I was shocked. I couldn't move. I almost froze in my bed. The Lebanese Civil War had been going on in the streets underneath our Beirut apartment for several months. But we had kind of toughed things like that out. We'd gone up to the mountains, and we couldn't understand why this time was different. But nevertheless, we had the 1 hour, one suitcase, and I panicked. I looked around, and then I thought, okay, what can I take with me? What do you take with you? And the most important thing in those days was my photos. Now, I guess you just grab your phone and go. But I ripped out, threw all my photo albums on the floor, ripped out every single picture that I had meticulously placed in, threw it in a suitcase, put in one pair of winter clothes, a couple pairs of summer clothes, type things, a week of underwear, and some hygiene items, and I was ready to go. And it was just a moment when you really don't think about. We rushed to the car, and it was waiting. It was my uncle, who was station manager at Pan American Airlines, and he was going for his last trip to the airport. He was going to go live in his airport office because the streets of Beirut were too dangerous to drive every day. And we got in the car and drove through empty streets. It was eerie. But Lebanon geographically is a beautiful country. On one side, we had the mountains. On the other side, we had the beautiful Mediterranean. And it almost felt like we were driving after, a nuclear war or something. There was no one there, except a few gangs of armed men, a few tanks from the Lebanese army that was, very weak, and there was nothing they could do to protect their citizens. And we were rushed to the airport. My family got onto the last Pan American flight to ever leave, and the passengers voted to wait for them. And my life in America, I was fortunate because I was able to go to a great country. I was able to continue my education. I was able to get established, and I started a career in aerospace. Very few women were there at the time, and it was very successful. But then my heart wasn't there, and my parents kept saying, "Come home, come home." And I loved Los Angeles, but I felt an emptiness in it. And so I decided I would go home. And most people would say, why would you go back to a war? Why would you go back to a place ridden with fear and death and destruction? But, you have to understand, Lebanon has a pull on people. It's a very small country. It's the size of Connecticut, and it's shaped like an eye. On the southern border of Lebanon, we share a border with Israel. And then on the other sides is Syria. But this land, for its size, has had a lot of impact. The cedars of Lebanon are mentioned from the Epic of Gilgamesh on. They're mentioned, Solomon built his temple from the cedars of Lebanon. They're mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in the Torah and the Quran. And it's on those shores that my ancestors, the Phoenicians, invented the alphabet. And it's from those shores that we exported the famous purple dye to the rest of the world. And the continent of Europe is named after a Phoenician goddess, Europa. And so we exported a lot more. We punched a lot heavier than our weight over the centuries. But we had become embroiled in a civil war that had sadly, and gotten everyone involved. And I went back. The war was still raging. I probably shouldn't have gone back, and I honestly don't know how we lived in those days, because you would go out, but you'd never know if you came back. And also, you would never know if you were going to be killed right where you were. I mean, our neighbor was killed closing the curtains to her balcony because it was getting dark and there was shelling and her kids were crying. And she thought, if I close the curtains, I'll block something out. Well, a shrapnel hit her and she was killed instantly in front of her children. Another friend died because she went up to get food. They were hiding in a shelter. And so you become a fatalist. You start thinking, okay, if it's meant to happen, it's going to happen to me. And you have to stop thinking in terms of you can control your life, you can control things. You start thinking of maybe it's more written, maybe it's more scripted like that. So I ended up leaving Lebanon. It was very traumatic, but I found out that, after almost 5 years, it just wasn't working out. I came back to the States, and it took me many years. I married, I had children, and it took me many years before I decided I could talk about it. And I just started a writing class and was encouraged. I was put into a workshop of published authors, and I was encouraged to show the story, but found out I had PTSD, and so I stopped writing. And that was my classmates were encouraging me that, you have to get this out. And finally, we decided that if I could take tragedy and turn it into purpose, maybe I could finish this book. And you see, in 2006, when Israel and Hezbollah declared war on Israel, and we felt helpless. We felt like we're a bunch of people on the ground. What can we do to make a difference? And so we started meeting a group of people in the Washington, D.C. area. Half were business professionals, half were medical doctors. And we met with the State Department, the U.S. Conference of Bishops, different groups, and we decided we could have impact if we helped educate students. And we realized that there's a whole network of schools across Lebanon that are religious schools, Christian religious schools, but that doesn't deter other people from going to them. So you go into South Lebanon, some of the villages, there's not a single Christian student. They're all Muslim students, but the parents are very happy to keep the children there. They're not taught religion in the school. They're taught just values. And so we decided if we could help students in those schools, we could make a difference because we could. And so we started working at it. And we go through a 501c3 charity just because I didn't want to be, involved in collecting the money. And I'm happy to say that to date, we've helped over 23,000 students in Lebanon. And so we turned pain into purpose. So I figured if I could push myself to write this novel, I could be helping students. So all the proceeds from the novel are dedicated to educating students in Lebanon. And I see that's where our future is. And I'll kind of leave it up to you if you want to ask questions.
Well, that's more or less the podcast. We can seal it here and just move on. But let's unpack a bit of what you've been talking about, because I think that clearly this is very, very passionate to you. Tell us a bit more about yourself, not just about your Lebanese background, but you come to the US originally in 1975.
Right. I was a student at the American University of Beirut, which is, a very well-known university, and it's educated many more people. Again, carries impact heavier than, its size. And I was able to finish in the University of Texas. They transferred all my credits, so that was kind of peace of mind. I ended up in California. I ended up working in aerospace, designing commercial aircraft cockpits. And so it was a cutting-edge field, and it was very exciting. So when I was going back to Beirut, it was like, what are you coming for? Fortunately, as soon as I got back, I got offered a job teaching at the university as an instructor, and I took that, and then I got offered a job at the airline in management. And so I did have good work. I had good jobs. Lots of interesting people were back in Beirut. You see, the Lebanese always felt they wanted to come back and build, and there's always a string that's attached to it. And I'm traditionally from the mountains of Lebanon. And my grandmother had lived through both world wars, the Ottoman occupation, and she had given us a lot of strength and a lot of wisdom over the years. And I also wanted to incorporate some of this wisdom and some of this strength. she used to tell us of women screaming in the night, and in the morning their babies would be dead. And that was during the Ottoman blockade. And more people per capita in the mountains of Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, died of starvation in World War I than anywhere else in the world. And then you had mass immigration, of course, out of the countries, America, South America, Africa, everywhere. And so she would tell us, how did you cope with that? How did you manage that? And she would just say, you can't complicate your lives. You have to believe in a higher authority. What you have to do is you have to use the brains you were given, and you make a decision, and then you make the sign of the cross and you go. What more can you do in your life? There's nothing else. It's beyond you. And yes, of course, we always talk about people who, like the professor who escaped from the university to go live in London and was killed in a car crash, and someone who died of pneumonia in a hospital in France. I mean, these things are not supposed to happen, but was it written for them to happen? I don't know. So that's kind of how you survive during these war times. And it's been tough. I mean, in Lebanon, it's a country where tragedy dances with dreams. You think, you've got these dreams, and then a tragedy happens, and you try to start dreaming again. But from what I've seen, I feel that I have a story to tell and a mission, and that is one of peace. I get very annoyed when people argue for war, any side, any place, because I just ask them 4 simple questions. One question is, have you ever had a friend kidnapped and you never knew what happened to them? I have. Have you ever missed a car bomb because you stopped for a cup of coffee? I have. Have you ever driven through sniper fire where you're the only car on the road and the sniper's aiming at you? I have. Have you ever seen body parts hanging from trees? I have. And until you've seen what I've seen and experienced what I've experienced, you have no right to argue for war. It doesn't solve anything.
That is absolutely true. But we may come back to that. But again, I want to understand what makes a woman, as you say, you wanted to tell the story. You sit down. How do you begin?
It's tough. I think anyone who wants to tell a story has to be held accountable, unless you've got extremely good discipline. And I held myself accountable by attending classes. And I had assignments that were due, and I couldn't let the classmates down. It had to be done, so I did it. And that helped a lot. And then you have to have, I guess, a vision, a goal, and you can do it. It's not easy. And I know when people say to me, "Oh, you finished a book." I mean, that's an accomplishment. Yeah, it's not easy. And just to give you an idea, out of all the books published in the U.S., 95% will sell 200 copies or less. Okay, it's only 5% that sell over the 200 copies. Now, again, there are people that write about my cat who has X-ray vision, and they sit down and scroll 2 pages on that.
A YouTube channel with that. Yeah.
And then, their friends might buy it, and a couple odd people here and there. So there's a lot of stuff out there that really should, but there's a lot of really good stuff out there. But it's a hard market. It's a tough market to be in.
Oh, tell me about it. I've been there on the nonfiction side. I've never tried fiction, but it's harsh.
It's very harsh, and you have to be ready for the, critics. And I mean, I've been fortunate. I've sold several thousand copies. I'm not as fortunate as I'd like to be, but and every 20 paperbacks helps keep a kid in school a whole year. So I keep, pushing on that. But yeah, in the US, and then again, of course, you probably know this. I know it's probably slightly different in Europe, but in the US, then you have to go through an agent. You can't go to Penguin and say, "Here's my manuscript," or you look at it. They won't. And in the US, the agents are very tough because a lot of the things they even select do not succeed, and they count on a small percentage to carry it through. And so it's very tough to get an agent. And every time I'd approach an agent, they'd read the first 50 pages, read the book, and say, "Oh, I really like it, but I don't think there's the audience for it. I don't think there's a mass market for it." And so that would throw me back again. But then I happened to come across a group that was started out of Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., and it was a professor who just his students and his colleagues were not getting enough ability to publish professionally. Yeah, you can go on and do self-publishing, but there are a lot, or you can go to hybrid publishing. And hybrid, for those who don't know, is kind of where you go to a publisher, they keep a percentage of it, say 20%. You keep 80, you pay for this publishing. And then the traditional model, they will publish 2,000 books and then you try to sell them. Now, I'm sure a lot of it's more done on demand. But I was speaking to a friend in New York who said, oh, there's this professor that I interviewed and he could be very interesting. And so I talked to him and he said, send me your manuscript. And I got a thing back from his intake editor saying, I love it. I love it. And it's a new press called New Degree Press. And they're done, everything is online. It's all on a platform. We used Quip, but I know Quip is going out now, which wasn't easy. So when I published, my developmental editor was in Texas. My marketing was in Florida. The cover design was done in Macedonia. The typesetting was done in Poland. The proofreading was done in New York. And it was all done, remotely. And, we interacted with each of these people until it all came together. Then we did pre-orders, and the pre-orders were the only ones printed. And so fortunately, I had about 700 books printed. And then those were sent to me, and the deal was they would be autographed and sent out again. And then it was all on demand. So it was a whole new way of looking at publishing from the traditional. I think in Europe you can still get to publishing houses easier, but I'm not sure.
I don't think that's the case, but in I think it very much depends on the language also.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I don't know if you have to have an agent, but I think it remains extremely difficult to get published. And you don't decide the market in many cases. I don't think that's the case in the US, and I don't think that's the case in Europe. And I doubt very much whether it's the case in other parts of the world. Sort of they will decide that this is suitable, they being publishing houses, this is suitable for this market, regardless of whether you've actually written for a completely different market or something like.
Yeah.
But I think that's also true in the US, by the way. If you do get access to one of the big publishing houses, they will still, silo you to a certain extent as you're going to write this, or that which you've written appeals to that market, or something like that. And it's business. We always tend to forget that publishing is business.
Yeah.
And, sort of because of AI, there's a huge issue right now with, is it going to be the end of novelists? Is it going to be the end of writing? I doubt it, but we really don't know. So the next step from how you're describing your publishing experience is AI, really, that, everything is like, tuck, 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 take everywhere. But I don't think anything will ever beat human experience. And I think that nothing will really beat you telling your story. And in your case, the pain comes through very clearly, but also this deep, deep attachment to Lebanon.
Yeah.
And your home country, which I think, as we discussed briefly before we started recording, is so true now, not just nowadays, must have been eternally true to people who are forced to leave their homelands, whether it's for economic reasons or safety reasons, and find a new life somewhere else.
It is. It is. And I constantly receive messages from people in Ukraine, from people Russia, from Gaza, Israel, people that have really suffered and are caught up in it. And I was giving a talk not too long ago where two Ukrainian sisters told me how guilty they feel living in the US. And, I had to say to them, in order to succeed, you have to have people inside and outside. If everybody stayed inside, we wouldn't succeed. So you've got to accept that people outside have to work towards helping the inside. And maybe that's the, way you do it. You don't feel the guilt, you feel the responsibility. And it's tough though, because you never feel you completely belong anywhere. And then I say to myself, well, okay, I'm a citizen of the world, but it's tough. I can fit in either place. I can fit in many places. Maybe that is the way the future is. Maybe that is what we experience now.
I think it's definitely the present. and the
Yeah.
future, but I think it's been the past for many years. We just didn't know about it, whether biblical migrations or whether, historic ones. Just, I mean, if you will, the whole story of the US is about migrants
Hmm.
fleeing or seeking a better life.
Yeah.
The whole story of Europe after the two world wars is of these completely shell-shocked people. By the way, they shell-shocked the rest of the world too. It should be emphasized here. But with after each war, upwards, between the two of them, upwards of 50 million people were moving about.
Yeah. And
And the reason that the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, is created is because there's so many refugees. There's so many people who are displaced by these wars and continue to be displaced ever since.
yes, yes, that's so true. That's so true.
So, unfortunately, I think it's a very basic human experience. And we keep trying to deny it and say that, oh no, if you just tweak, if we just twitch this a bit, then you don't need to be a refugee or you don't need to be a migrant. But I think it's something that's very common to many peoples. That was one of the thoughts I had when I was reading your lovely book, that, I spend some time each year in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian experience is not only, as you describe, of these two women you spoke to, but even just what you were talking about before, that, don't stand near a window,
Yeah.
dangerous. Go and sleep in the corridor. Don't sleep, don't be anywhere near a window. And people who are reluctantly, even now, after nearly 5 years of war, are leaving, but so reluctantly because they just feel so tied to Ukraine, but their children usually find it impossible to live. So it is, unfortunately, as I say, I think a far more common experience, but you've put it into words really beautifully. And when you crafted the words, how much of yourself is in there? And how much did you sort of add on in because you thought that that wouldn't work in print, let's say?
No, a lot of me's in there, and was a heart-wrenching book to write because everything in the book is true, and the 95% of it is my life, but there's nothing in there that's made up. The characters are true, the lives are true, and I came from a society where everyone got along. And if you notice in the book, I'm a Christian, but in the book I made the kindest, nicest book called Uncle Muhammad. And I made him gentle and loving and, the uncle everyone wanted. And then I told the story of the Jewish family, the rabbi's family in Beirut, another true story, where they were neighbors. And the girls were born within days of each other, played together. It was, we're like sisters. And the rabbi used to joke, if we switched our daughters, we'd never know the difference. They were identical. And then how does, I don't want to say culture, but how do events and circumstances separate people when we all kind of start out the same? And then again in the book, I used the example of the woman who was the best friend of the rabbi's daughter, and how did she come so alienated and feel that a group of people was bad or whatever when they were part of her in a way because she grew up with them. And there was love there and kindness. And so I kind of wanted to show the human story. So Glass Cedars, I should have put a copy of my book back here. I have one right here, Anna. I should have been more professional and stacked it right here.
Absolute, go for it.
There we go. If it stands up. But it's kind of like I wanted to show that we're all human, we're all more similar than different, and that life can change in an instance. And we can learn to hate. We're not born hating, we learn to hate. We learn to dislike, we learn to distrust. And that's the sad thing. And there's no reason for that. I mean, I'm of the belief that if you put people of 10 different ideas in a room and they shared something personal about themselves and got to on a level of connection, we wouldn't hate each other. They would understand each other. And that's, I think, where we're failing in a lot of these instances. We're not looking at people as people. We're looking at them as ideas or part of a group we don't like. Or, yeah, you dislike a theory, an idea, a way of life, but do you really dislike the people in it?
Don't you think that you would have to qualify your experiment by people not knowing the background of the other people?
Probably, especially if they're older, because we're already so molded. And, when I grew up, we never knew what or who anyone was. We just knew if there was a holiday, that's where we went for good food. We went to, I mean, what more do you want, right? We went to celebrate Jewish holidays, Muslim holidays. I grew up, I knew 5 synagogues in Beirut. And I had Jewish friends, I had Muslim friends, Christian friends, but we didn't know what anyone was. And we never thought about it. And that's how I grew up. And that's what's so sad, that people are being deprived of this. And even in Lebanon now, you see it. You see communities that don't venture into the other area, or if they do, it's very cautious. And this is wrong. And this is where we're making mistakes.
I think we're making huge mistakes. But let me take you back actually to 1975 when the Civil War breaks out. What were the steps leading up to the war? How did you feel about that? You were a 20-year-old young woman, I think, in the book at least. So you
Yeah,
were aware.
we were and we weren't. I was at the university and we had a lot of demonstrations, and they were political. And, Time magazine came out a few years before, I think it was Time or Newsweek, and called it Guerrilla U. And my parents were furious. But there were a lot of political movements going on. But I want to say the majority of students were not that involved. It's kind of like maybe what happened on campuses here. Yes, you get a significant number, but it's not the majority. And so we just kind of went about our daily life. Now, Lebanon had always been impacted by other events in the area. I mean, I remember when Gamal Abdel Nasser died, waking up, geez, like at 4 a.m, and
The
people were
leader of
trying,
Egypt.
yeah, the ruler of Egypt. Yeah, people were in the streets under the balcony of, under the window of my bedroom, and they were shouting, da, da, da. And we couldn't, in those days, of course, my father got up and turned on the radio, and then we realized they were demonstrating. But what do we in Lebanon have to do with, the leader of Egypt dying? But everybody was involved in everything. And Beirut is a very open society. The blessing of Lebanon is you can say anything you want. Now, some organizations might kill you for saying it now, but I grew up in a place where I don't remember 17 daily newspapers or something crazy were published in different languages. And, we had communists and we had whatever democracies and so people just kind of accepted everything. It was all there. And now to come to a place where things are more restricted and more fearful is not right.
I think for a lot of people, it's not clear what went wrong. Why did it go from this very open place, very successful place, to suddenly, I mean, it should be explained to people who don't know that when France created modern Lebanon, though France, why is France there to start with? Let's leave that aside. But nonetheless, there was a division between the different ethnicities and religions in order to try and balance out.
Yeah, yeah. The Lebanon was created after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and it stayed a French mandate. And what they did was they set up a parliament according to population. And there was a French general who felt, well, maybe there should be a Christian-dominated country in the Middle East, and the majority here was. So they took Mount Lebanon. 60% of the population was Christian. And Mount Lebanon was all, but the area they did. And they added the north and the south. And those were sparsely populated at the time. Muslim areas, some Sunni, and then the Bekaa Valley, which was Shiite. Parts of the south were Shiite too. And the whole thing was kind of put together. And the parliament was written according to population numbers. So 60% of the parliament was Christian. And then that was split among the different Christian sects. And then the president had to be a Maronite Catholic. The prime minister had to be a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of the house had to be a Shiite Muslim. So it was all done along religious lines, which was not good. But that's the way they did it. And then when Lebanon, well, when Lebanon won independence, that's what happened. The French helped write the Constitution. Over the years, the population changed and the government was weak and corrupt, and a lot of foreign ideas came in, a lot of foreign money. And Lebanon has suffered from foreign occupations, causing trouble within the country. And so I personally believe the Lebanese, given the opportunity, would all pretty much get along. Yes, they would have significant differences, but I don't think they would want to destroy their country, given the chance. But what can I say? It's the NGOs that are keeping a lot of country going.
Absolutely. We should point out here, for those not familiar with the periods you're talking about, that France received Lebanon as part of the mandate after the First World War. It had wanted to occupy it as a colony, but after the First World War, it was impossible for the UK and France to receive new colonies because it was banned by the US and the League of Nations. So this is the period of which we speak in many ways. Modern Lebanon went independent in remind me the year?
Oh, don't ask me history. I had to look it up. But yeah, it
I
was, I
think it
think, in the
was
40s. But I
it was
obviously,
1942 or
yeah,
43. It's
yeah, it's
actually
early.
before the end of the First World War. But anyway, just to give the context of the years in which we're speaking, it was a period in which France still had colonial ambitions, in which the whole area was just being divvied up between the French and the British in the most bizarre way, including, as we know, the then Palestine. This starts in 1917 with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But ethnicities were just, divided all over the place and, very much
Yeah.
the usual lack of logic that came.
Yeah, the history is complicated. And, everyone has their own interpretation of it. So I just, when I wanted to write a story, I just wanted a people story. Because I think people are suffering everywhere. The circumstances are different, but really, in the bottom line, they're all the same. There's a lot of power struggles, a lot of greed, a lot of people who think their ideas are superior and think they should rule. But the people are the sufferers. And most people, in my opinion, just want a decent life. They just want to be able to get up, have a job, take care of their kids, go out, do things. And I don't think people are complicated. I think the majority of people just want simplicity and just want, a standard. And you even see that in the migrants. They're not coming to change something or to do something or to take advantage. They just want something better than what they have. And so this is what's really hard in the world.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of the things that strikes me, though, is that you're not, you produce these wonderful cast of characters, both in Lebanon and in the US. And I'm not going to ask you if they're real or not, but you're suggesting there's different types of, if you want, migrants. There's those who just say, right, I'm going to fit in no matter what.
Mhm.
And there's those, to a certain extent, like yourself, who permanently caught in a sense of, I can't leave my home. Is that still the case, do you think?
That's a hard question because there's no, and I know you're in Europe and all, but there's no better place, in my opinion, than the US. I mean, I think it's the greatest country that ever existed. Granted, there are lots of issues and problems, but they're solvable. It's just a phenomenal place. And I am so grateful and I'm so much in love with the country and, everything it represents. And I'm not talking people who are representing it necessarily, but the whole idea of the country and, the opportunities it gives everyone. And Lebanon, though, is the emotional side of me. And, some older writers, I think, older Lebanese writers that came in the early 1900s to the US wrote about that. Logic is in one place and heart is in another, brains in one, heart in another. And that's so true. It's just really hard to differentiate. Now, of course, with modern technology, maybe we are, connecting better and, you can travel better and go easier from one place to the next. But it's still the case. And but this is my home now. I mean, I will never, I know I will never leave the US. I will leave to visit. I will leave this, but this is, where my home is. My children were all born here. They're all here. Yes, they'll go back and visit, but in varying degrees. And I'm lucky, I'm fortunate.
You are lucky, you are fortunate. And I want to raise that in relation to maybe current US and current Europe and current many parts of the world that seems to reject migrants and immigrants and doesn't want new people to come. In your book, you describe kindness from everyone and an
Mm.
expectation that, yeah, you'll just become American and that'll be fine. What do you think has changed so much?
I think what's changed maybe is the numbers, the amount and the mass media that shows it to us. And, when I came, there weren't so many people coming. And it's like I was reading the other day about Americans visiting Europe. They used to trickle into Europe, and now they're massive into Europe, tourists and whatever. And I think that's kind of a parallel. People would trickle in and they would assimilate and they would, yeah, they had some communities, but now it's more massive and it's more in your face. And I think that's what frightens people. It's not like people are abiding. When I came, people abided by the rules. You did this document, you applied. But now people are kind of crashing in. And I think that's frightening the existing populations and places. It's not that they're necessarily against it, but it's just that let's go through the process and then it's fine. But
Mm.
you can't, send a herd in and expect it to be accepted. So I think that has something to do with it.
And how do you feel in relation to that? Because again, you yourself are an immigrant. You write very touchingly about this process of coming to America and being accepted. So how do you think, is this right? What's happening now?
What do you mean, the not accepting of?
Yes.
Again, I think if the people kind of applied and came in, didn't sneak in or, push in, I think they would be accepted.
Mm.
I think we maybe have to change our quotas, our acceptance of people, but we have to make it so that, but I think anybody is frightened when you see massive groups of people coming that are uncontrolled. It's not that these people are bad or anything. It's that, they're desperate and they need an opportunity. But, maybe we have to prepare for this and prepare it better than we have been.
Mm. Mm.
And that's part of the problem. And in my opinion, it's not that they're coming, it's how extensive it is that is scaring people off.
Interesting. The other thing that very much struck me is that you talk about fabulous women in the US, you talk about fabulous women in that you work with, and you talk about fabulous women in your family and some in the university. But one of the most striking things is there's no mention of, where are women in the conflict, really, in Lebanon? Is that because they just, there's no strong women's voices in Lebanon?
Sadly, no. Sadly, no. It's a little better now, but sadly, no. And the women in Lebanon, they're running the NGOs. They're keeping the country going. I mean, they are phenomenal what they're doing, and they're all involved. But they're not that involved in politics, and they need to be more involved. They're involved in business. They're involved, like I said, in the NGOs. But yeah, we need, of course, more women voices to come up there because they're competent. I mean, and they've always been. And you were talking about the independence of Lebanon. My dad used to demonstrate for Lebanese independence, and two of his best friends demonstrated with him all the time. And one was a pediatrician who had studied at the American University of Beirut, and the other was a publisher, writer, and a publisher. And this is in the late 30s, 40s, and they were very well educated. Lebanese women have always been well educated, but they just have not taken the voice. And I think part of it, well, it's a problem everywhere, isn't it? I mean, look at the US, we don't have great opportunities that women have become leaders. They just haven't made it yet. And people are very reluctant. The women themselves are a bit reluctant and the society's reluctant.
Why are the women reluctant?
In the US, I think because now it's just my opinion, I think a lot of them see it as a vicious world and a male world, and they're not welcome in a lot of the places. It's not that I'm not as smart as the guy. It's just that he seems more welcome in the old boys club than I am. And I think that's part of it. I think the attitudes have to change. But yeah, I mean, we have some very competent women, but they just haven't gone enough places.
Right. And in Lebanon, do you think it's an issue of tradition?
I don't think it's so much tradition. I just think it's more the network is even tighter. Like I'm saying, in the 40s, with the people demonstrating with my dad, or the late 30s, were educated women. They were whatever, they were, and in the medical school, they were huge numbers, but they were there. And they were active and they were accepted by their male colleagues. But I just think it's kind of phenomena everywhere that we're not accepting more women, and maybe more women aren't wanting to enough. Maybe it's not in our DNA. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that the world of politics in general, in the Western world, I just don't have enough of a capacity to speak to other parts, um, has become increasingly unpleasant.
Mm,
And intelligent, pleasant people, of which I count many women, just don't want to get involved in it. And this is a downward spiral
yeah.
that, women don't feel comfortable, but so do a lot of people that, sort of the male persuasion or other genders. They don't feel comfortable. If you're an educated, intelligent, professional person who's used to being working with intelligent, courteous, professional people, you don't want to go into something that is really not very pleasant
Yeah.
in its environment. I think that's, sort of one problem. The other problem is that it's become a profession. And whereas I think a lot of people are still thinking that it's a calling, that,
Yeah.
you do, you know, you work hard, you gain a profession or you do whatever it is. And then, in your next career or the next stage of your life, you want to give back, whereas a lot of politicians, nowadays they start out either at university, or if they don't go to university, they start out, sort of being an assistant to somebody at a very young age, and they rise in the hierarchy, and getting elected is a promotion in many ways, as opposed to being a calling. So I think we're looking at a really big problem from that point of view. Before you even get to issues in the States, money talks so much with
Yeah.
PACs and whatever. So I think it's a big problem that, basically the most decent people, which isn't a way of saying all politicians are indecent, but I think that people who maybe in previous eras would have gone into politics, especially women, just feel this is not an environment they want to be part of.
Yeah. And I think that holds for a lot of I don't want to say decent, but a lot of the competent men, you know,
Mm,
a lot of them are just backing out. It's just
yeah.
not where I want to be. And that's a sad situation.
It is a very, very sad situation because it's leaving us all in a place in which we don't really want to join in at
Yeah.
that level because it's not pleasant, but we're leaving it in the hands of people we don't like. And it's a problem. It's a real problem in the Western world, which is how you do end up with characters you don't like, you're not fond of, you don't agree with, ruling.
Mhm.
And it's becoming, I think, an ever greater problem. But that is not the subject of our conversation.
You're going to have to edit all this out.
I don't know. We'll see. But um, I do think we're moving towards the end of this lovely conversation, Kathy. And I would just like to understand, and especially I think for our listeners who are yet to read your book, um, there is a happy afterlife to it. The book is a book of hard toil of
Yeah.
your life, but just give us a glimpse what happens afterwards so that people don't feel, oh, gone, is it all just bad?
Well, sadly, and I don't want to say the end of the book, but ironically, the developmental editor and I had an argument over it because she said you should change the ending. American audiences won't like it. And I said, no, the ending has to be true. And she said, yeah, but we have poetic license here. We can, manipulate some things. And I said, I don't think so. It has to be. I think the strong ending in the book is the love, the power of love, the power of people's connection to each other and how they look after each other. Despite the tragedy and the horrors of war, the power of love among people is stronger. And that's what it kind of hope will overcome, the sadness that people have to deal with. But it's not easy. It's not easy. Like I said, I didn't realize I had PTSD till I started writing. And then it all started coming back. And you have to use a lot of strength to overcome it and to look for something brighter on a horizon.
I think that is so true. But do you feel as though the PTSD actually has gone now, or will it be with you forever?
No, I don't think it ever goes. I think it goes more dormant, and that you try to turn it into a positive force like I did with, donating proceeds from the book. And I think, okay, I did this and I went through this, but hey, a bunch of kids can stay in school because of it. So that kind of gives me power over it because it's usually the most powerful thing. And, you're trying to tackle it in this, but I found that that was a tool of power and something I could control that made it not so dominant for me. I mean, everybody has different ways of handling it, but for me, that worked. And when it comes up, I just try to think of, well, look at the good that came out of it. And so that's what I bank on.
Well, one of the very big goods that came out of it is, of course, your lovely book, Glass Cedars.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for joining us.
Thanks. And I hope your listeners will read it and put comments on it. That would be wonderful.
That would be wonderful indeed. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast. And on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And we're on YouTube. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beitel, together with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.